Today I'm going to walk you through this mandala canvas project, teaching you how to do a sea urchin design in the center and doing the circles on the outside. So for this project, I'm doing a 4x4 canvas that I have primed with black gesso and black satin paint. I am just using a watercolor pencil to draw an X from corner to corner to find my center. And then I'm using a compass to just do a circle where I think I'm going to let the sea urchin design end. I end up doing a couple of circles just to kind of give myself a few options in case I wanted it to go a little bit farther out, which I actually ended up doing. I also measured to find the center of all the sides so that I can do vertical lines going through the center, because for sea urchin design, I'm going to want as many lines as I can to help keep the pattern straight. Whenever I do guidelines, I always make sure to not push the pencil down too hard. To just kind of leave like a light line that just makes it easier to remove afterwards. But I've had no trouble removing watercolor pencil from any of my canvases. If you are using chalk, don't push down very hard because you don't want to leave a thick line because it will make it hard to remove afterwards. It can also deform your dots if you're using chalk pencil and your line is too thick. I wanted even more guidelines, so I ended up using this little Helix protractor that I have. If you just have a regular protractor, that's all you needed. I just couldn't find mine, so I grabbed this one instead. And I'm just finding where I want to place another guideline, and I decided to go in between the line that's on the corner and the center of the canvas, finding that center spot and just making a little mark there on all four corners on both sides. And then once I was done with that, I could just go in with a ruler to connect those lines to give me all those additional angles for my sea urchin. Because with sea urchins, I want as many of these lines as possible and I want them to be as straight as possible. Also, when you are doing guidelines, make sure that your base coat has been dry for over 24 hours. This just ensures that the paint's not wet. So that way when you draw the lines won't dry with the paint, making them impossible to remove. So with this part, I always take my time because with a sea urchin design, you really want these lines to be as perfect as possible because it will show in the design if they're not exactly right. And so I finally got my guidelines where I wanted, but I decided to go ahead and add one more circle because I wanted to extend the sea urchin design a little bit farther out. So for my paint consistency, you can see here that when I lift the tool out of this paint, that it settles back down to be flat. So my paint is really thick here, and I want it to be thick because I want nice round plumpy dots. I don't want my dots to be flat. And testing it like that to see that that little peak flattens back out lets me know that it's going to become a domed shaped dot and it's not going to have that point in it when it dries. So I always load up this first dot or any larger dots with a lot of extra paint. I don't push the tool all the way down. I just let that paint get pulled off, and that's going to leave me with a nice plumpy dot. So to start this piece, I am going to start with the outside circle because the secret to doing sea urchins is you want to start on the outside and work your way in. I'm going to go over this several times, but first we're just going to focus on the circle. So I chose a tool here that would allow me to dot on that circle that I had placed. For me, it was that size. And it allowed me to place a dot on each line and then two dots in between, making this really easy pattern to get an evenly spaced circle going all the way around. So if you need to use a slightly larger tool or a smaller tool, feel free to do so. If you want to make this circle a little bit smaller and put three dots in between and a dot on each line, go for it. I My choice on tool size here was based on what was going to be easiest to do this circle without having to worry about making any mistakes or getting my spacing off. So just take your time with this section. Some of these dots I do end up adding extra paint to, just to make sure that when they dry, they will be nice and round. And doing it this way with guidelines will help you in the future when you don't have guidelines, because you kind of have some muscle memory knowing how well to space the dots in order to do a perfect circle. So for this yellow section, I'm going to start from the outside and work my way in. I'm starting with the larger end of the dotting tool and doing 3 dots, and then I switch to the smaller end and I am doing 4 to 5 dots and then walking the dots all the way up. So I start from the outside to work my way in for several reasons. One, I used to always work sea urchins starting from the inside, working my way out, and I found that when I got to where the blue circle is, on one side I may have a lot more room than the other side, and with your dots being so large, you can't really hide that. And if you try to make your dot a little bit larger or smaller, it really messes up your spacing to the right and left of that dot, causing you so many problems. You avoid all of this by starting on the outside and moving your way in. Because if you need to put less dots on one row, it's not going to matter, because no one's going to see those small dots and notice that that row has less dots. It's easier to hide, and it's not going to mess up your spacing to the right and to the left. And by starting on the outside, you have that outside row where it all meets up nice and perfectly. It gives you a more clean look to your sea urchin and makes it a lot easier on you. Also, whatever small lines you're going to do those first, because then you're going to have these nice straight small lines, and it's really going to make your work stand out. A lot of times you see people doing them at the end, and you'll notice that the lines tend to get a little bit wavy because it's a lot harder to squeeze those dots in, the small dots in at the end. If you just do them first, it's another way to get a nice clean look on a sea urchin, because it's much easier to do the bigger dots in a straight line than it is for the smaller ones. So my advice, always start from the outside, work your way in, and do your small lines first on your grid lines. So next I am doing another line on the grid lines, and it's going to be slightly larger in size. So I'm going to use a different tool going all the way around, and then I will switch tools, and I'll kind of continue to do that as I work my way up into the smaller tools. I started with the smallest dots first and moved my way up. So my yellow dots are the smallest, my red dots are just slightly bigger, and then these orange dots, there's a pretty big jump up in size. And I decided I'm going to do another rainbow piece, so I'm going to be working with all the different rainbow colors, and all these paints I mixed up in a previous YouTube video that you can see on my channel. And please subscribe, guys, if you like my tutorials or you want to learn more. And if you have any suggestions for me, please drop them down below. I would love to hear from you guys, and I would love to create content that you guys would want to see. So here I am just slowly getting to smaller sizes until I work my way all the way up. And I just find it easier, since I don't want to constantly switching tools with each line, that I'm just using the one tool going all the way around the circle and then slowly moving up to a smaller size for the next row. And take your time with all of these. Try to get it stay on the line as much as possible, and to kind of keep your spacing the same. In general, on most of these, I ended up doing the same dots on each row. There's a couple that may have one less, but like I said, in the end, when the piece is done, you don't notice it because those are the small dots and you can't see them. So just take your time with these. Use whatever tools that you may need to use. So for this section, I'm using the big end for this first dot, and then I switch to the small end for the rest. But if you need to use the small end for all of those dots, then you go for it and just do whatever works right for your piece. And feel free to change up the colors too. I am just on this rainbow kick right now. So I am just using up these colors because I thought they would be fun. And for this sea urchin, I actually did different colors than I normally would because I tend to go more blue and purple. And for some reason, I went really strong on like orange and green, which isn't something I normally do, but it was different and fun to kind of play around with. So you can pick whichever colors you would like. So now I've decided to go to the bigger dots. And with these, I am loading them up with extra paint just to make sure that when they dry, they won't have the little peaks on them. This paint's a little bit thicker than I think than my yellow paint. You can see my peaks are taking a little bit longer to flatten out, but they are flattening out. So it is perfect paint. But I did watch it kind of closely to make sure that those were going to flatten out. I didn't need to thin my paint down a little bit more. So that first number was the size I used for the first green dot, and then the second one is the size that I am using now. So I'm looking really closely at my spacing, just getting it in between the yellow and the orange line, and I'm trying to keep my spacing between green dots the same on each side, but really just trying to fill in the space as closely as possible, trying to keep the dots the same size as much as possible, which will help me keep it symmetrical throughout. Starting from the outside, it just ends up giving it a more finished look, and it ends up looking a lot cleaner in the ends. My next tool size, I went down to a smaller size, and just the same idea, just going to go all the way around, filling in that space. And just take your time with this. I really enjoy this part of the process because it's really not much to think about other than tool size. And what I do is when it's time to go to a smaller tool, I kind of measure first before I put paint on it to kind of see if it's going to fit. And then if so, I'll test it out a couple of rounds. And so right here, I'm using the bigger end of the dotting tool for one dot. I then switched to the small end of the smallest tool to do the rest of these dots because that's what I needed to fill the space. Be sure to clean your tools on a regular basis. Do it every several dots because if you don't, the paint will build up on your tool and your dots will gradually get larger and it can throw off your symmetry. So next I decided to bring in the purple, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to do on the other side, if I was going to do another row of purple or if I was going to bring in the blue. So while I was thinking about it, I just stuck with just doing the purple rows. And this is the size tool I use, but be sure to save these tools, set them off to the side because I'm going to use the exact same sizes for the next section as well. But I just wasn't sure if I was going to continue with purple, and I decided I was not going to continue with purple and ended up switching to blue on the other side. So I used a slightly smaller tool to just continue this pattern, and I'm just going to do this going all the way up until I get to that yellow center. Just watching closely my spacing, trying to keep it as even as possible in all the sections so they end up with the same amount of dots. But if you don't worry about it. As I said before, the small dots, no one's going to notice. So here I just went straight into the small end of the dotting tool to finish off this section. And it's 1, 2, 3, 4 dots. And I just try to do that going all the way around. And you can see there I ended up having 5, but when the piece is done, you're not going to be able to tell. So then I did decide to go ahead and bring the blue in. And so that way I have all the colors except for poor indigo. Indigo got left out again. But I have the rest of the colors on this one. I'm using the same size tools as I was in the previous row because I just had them laying out because I knew I would, it's the same amount of space, so less work for me to try to figure out. And yeah, on these I'm having to dot them a couple of times to make sure they're nice and plumpy. So next I decided to do circles going all the way around. And with this, the next tool size I picked, I made sure that it would fit at the corners of all four sides. And that's the size I ended up going with. And I just did this going all the way around. The big secret with this one is I always paint it in this direction where I can see where I've been and I can see where I'm going. And that really helps me keep the symmetry of the circle. And this first one, I actually am lucky that I also have another guideline right there. So that helps me too. But in general, I tend to just focus on the row before it and I just look at where I've been and where I'm going, and that helps me with my spacing. When I get to this point, I end up just kind of looking at my spacing and seeing that I could fit two more in there to finish off that circle. Next, I decided to go ahead and bring the green and bring the brighter colors out towards the outside to kind of brighten it up a little bit. And whenever I do these corners, I always pick a tool and get it as close to that edge as I can and then start walking it out. And when you get to these sides, just go ahead and dot it like you had enough canvas to complete the dot. And what it will happen is on the edge of the canvas, the dot will just stop. So your paint should be thick enough here where it's not dripping down the sides, and it will just kind of cut the dot off in half, almost like it was a piece of paper and you just cut it off. And I'm just going to continue making the circle going all the way around. And when you get to these little edges right here, just kind of look at your spacing and keep the same spacing going. And it will give it the effect of almost like someone just chopped the mandala off in half. So here I went to that top section and worked my way down because if I was going to have any extra space, I wanted it to be on the side because it would be less noticeable. And then for the orange, I'm doing the same thing. You know, I just start in that bottom corner wherever I can make a complete dot. And then I just fill in this space that's left over with the little half dots. This will give you a cleaner look doing it this way, as you won't have as many half dots hanging around. Next, I switched to red, and I'm using the same tool for all these dots. I never switched tools. I was going to originally, and then I just decided, no, I'm just going to stick with it. And I'm glad I did. It just kind of gave it a nice uniform look. Sometimes I switch to go to smaller tools, bigger tools, stuff like that. And I'm not lining these dots up with the previous row at all. It's all about spacing based off of the corner. Just placing that first dot wherever I can get a complete dot and then working my way off to each side. Now for the yellow, I wanted to make sure that yellow dot hit right in that corner. So I did the center dot first and then did the two half dots off to the side. And then I decided not to do top dots on this one as well. So this is the finished piece. If you like this tutorial or have any suggestions, please leave a comment below. And please subscribe. Thanks, guys.